Obviously, we don't need to talk about tier one. You're starting them regardless. I mean, if for whatever reason you're not playing Chase, Jefferson, Collins, A.J. Brown, St. Brown, Puka, Cup, Wilson, I would take a long look in the mirror and ask yourself what you are doing wrong. Now, going down to tier two, here, starting off with Davante Adams, I understand that he has been very disappointing as a New York Jet. And obviously, this Jets offense has been absolute garbage. And y'all know I am one to admit I'm an idiot. A big thing that I do is trust sportsbook data because it's been proven over a large sample that you're not able to beat sportsbooks. I'm not able to beat sportsbooks. And what they are projecting out right this second is a 24-point implied team total for the New York Jets. And if this stands, obviously we just got the update that Anthony Richardson will be playing the Jets here. The Jets should be an above average offense this week. And if the Jets are an above average offense, here Davante Adams is seeing a ton of volume. I mean, since he's arrived here in New York, the man has averaged about 9.75 targets a game. So effectively 10 targets a game over the past month. So you have all the volume in what's supposed to be a much improved offense for this week in particular. So I think you can go with them. Drake London typically is higher than Davante Adams in these rankings. Typically, London's more exciting than this. The only hesitation I'd have with London this week is obviously it's a very tough matchup here going up against the Denver Broncos. They are able to shut down opposing wide receiver ones. Usually you see Drake London like higher, lower, 72.5 total yards on Underdog. His Underdog pick'em this week is actually only higher, lower, 60.5. Clearly, the projections are coming down. You saw that DeAndre Hopkins was limited severely in this matchup last week. And right now, you have an implied team total of only about 20.75 points here going up against Denver. Just should be a much tougher spot for this Falcons offense in general. Terry McLaurin is in the game tonight. And with Terry, I think that this is maybe the second time we have ranked him as a top 12 wide receiver this season. The last time we did so was week 7 against the Carolina Panthers. There he was a top 10 option for us. With McLaurin, the target volume hasn't necessarily been there just because obviously this is an offense that is a very effective rushing attack. I mean, you only have one game this season with more than 8 targets for Terry McLaurin, but it doesn't really matter with how efficient he has been. I mean, if you're looking at McLaurin, since week 3, every single week he has given you at least 10 fantasy points. And since week 3, you only have 1 week with fewer than 15. So he's had an incredibly high floor so far this season. And honestly, if you're looking at his Underdog pickup right now, it's higher, lower, 62.5 receiving yards. I wouldn't fault you if you wanted to go with the higher tonight. Our next option will be Tyreek Hill. I understand a lot of people are upset that we're still ranking Tyreek Hill as a number 1 wide receiver. And I completely understand why, right? Tyreek Hill has been absolutely garbage. Tyreek Hill has been probably the most disappointing option in round 1 of drafts this year that was not directly impacted by an injury himself. With Tyreek, you have a total of 1 game, and I mean 1 game this season with 15 or more fantasy points. That was back in week 1 against Jacksonville. Now, to be fair to Tyreek Hill, you've played 4 games fully with Tua. And in those 4 games, you've seen 26, 13, 12, and 11.5 fantasy points. So you are averaging about 15 points per game with Tua in this offense, which does put Tyreek a little more as a wide receiver 2 than a wide receiver 1. You're going to have to be on the lookout for updates with the wrist ligament injury that you have. But I mean, currently Underdog has Tyreek Hill higher, lower, 72.5 total yards. If you look at sportsbooks, they are currently projecting out the Dolphins to be a top 5 offense in the NFL in total points scored this week, going up against a very soft Raiders defense. Now, of course, I think a lot of these are scored by Achane. I think the Dolphins should be able to run the ball here consistently. So Achane's a tier 1 player. Tyreek is still a must-start option. For the love of God, do not overthink it. And of course, if you think that Tyreek Hill's a bum, you're more than welcome to go take fewer than 72.5 total yards on Underdog. I mean, he only had 16 yards this past week, but I'm going to be honest with you, I would not take the fewer than 72.5 total yards. I think Tyreek Hill gets you a big bounce back this week, but if you wanted to, it's on Underdog Fantasy. Links in the description, links in the comment section. Promo code FLOCK, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you'll get a free Jalen Hurts pick in the game tonight, more than less than half a total yard, and a free team review in the live stream we're doing every day as well. Now, going over to our next option with Deebo Samuel, you currently have the Niners projected to be the second highest scoring offense in the NFL this week, and you have an over-under in this game about 51, 52 points. So it should be a very high scoring contest. Now, of course, with Deebo, he was outscored by both Ricky Pearsall as well as Juwan Jennings this past week. And I see a lot of people screaming in the comment section going, oh, Deebo's overrated. Oh, Deebo's a bum, blah, 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 blah. I understand where you're coming from, but ultimately, if you take a step backwards here and you look at Deebo Samuel in games where he has been fully healthy and played at least 70% of the snaps, you've seen 18, 18, 10, 3, 20, and 12 and a half fantasy points. Am I sitting here saying this is phenomenal? No, of course not. But now you have no Brandon Ayuk in this offense. While yes, Jennings and Pearsall were great this past week, if you're looking at the sample size that we have of Deebo Samuel relevance in fantasy in comparison to the sample size that you're working with both Ricky Pearsall as well as Juwan Jennings, you have a long track record for Deebo, who was just drafted in 2019. It's not like you're expecting to fall off here. It's not like he's 33 years old by any means. So I still stand by. Deebo's a must-start wide receiver every week. DK Metcalf may be ranked ahead of Deebo in our rest of season ranks. The issue is right now the Seahawks are like 6.5 point dogs here. The offense should be much worse. Obviously, it's a tough matchup going up against the Niners. I did just trade for Metcalf in the Flock League, though, so I'm really hoping our guy comes through for us, of course. Now, our next wide receiver is going to be George Pickens. I think this may be the highest I have ever ranked George Pickens through his entire NFL career. But, I mean, clearly he's been a much more efficient wide receiver since you had Russell Wilson come into the picture. I mean, looking at over the past 3 games that he has played, the man's sitting with 22, 18.5, and 18.2 yards per reception. If you're looking at his yards per target, he's averaging about 13. He's been hyper efficient. You've seen 2 touchdowns over the past 3 weeks. Now, obviously, efficiency is up and down. But the thing is, for this week, it's a phenomenal matchup going up against the Baltimore Ravens, where we have seen Baltimore allow an insane amount of points to opposing wide receivers. I understand that Pickens isn't Chase, but I still think that Pickens is a very safe play here with Russ and the matchup. CeeDee Lamb will be our next player. Now, I know a lot of people were very upset with us for ranking CeeDee Lamb as a wide receiver 2 last week rather than a wide receiver 1. I'm going to stick with it, and I'm going to reiterate what we've been saying. This is Miami without Tua. We literally saw it earlier in the year. You're seeing it in Jacksonville right now without Lawrence. These offenses, when they lose their starting quarterback, if they don't have a viable number 2, and I swear to God, if y'all try to tell me one more time that Cooper Rush is great, I may lose my mind. You are going to see a collapse with fantasy points at quarterback, running back, wide receiver. It is going to impact every single player, including one of the most talented wide receivers in the league. I had Lamb ranked, I believe, as my wide receiver 2 rest of season before you had the Dak injury. I was super high on Lamb, but you need to go through and just take a new assessment. Right now, you have an implied team total of 17.25 points here in Dallas. This is right there with like the Tennessee Titans projecting out to be the worst offense in the NFL. We go back and look at the projections on Underdog where you have a higher lower 72.5 total yards for Tyreek. Here with Lamb, you're higher lower 59.5 total yards. Now, to be honest with you, I still think that CeeDee Lamb's a must-start wide receiver every week. And would it be the most surprising thing in the world if Lamb had 7 receptions for 80 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown this next game? Of course not. That's why you have to start him. Just the floor is so much lower than what it's going to be with a lot of those other wide receivers that are inside the top 10 and are must-start options regardless of the team that you have. Now, going over to our next player, we are going to be looking at Jayden Reed. With Reed, obviously the ceiling's always there. The floor is always very low, though. This is a wide receiver that has had 1 game this season with more than 6 targets. If you're going game by game, 6, 2, 6, 8, 6, 6, 4, 3, 6 targets. Now, of course, a lot of these contests, the man goes out there, you get the big play, the efficiency is off the charts, and that has given him a very high ceiling where we've seen a game with 27 fantasy points. We've seen a game with 33 fantasy points. Now, this matchup against Chicago isn't a great one. While at the same time, the Bears actually project out to be a bottom 3 offense in the NFL this week. The spread on this game is about a touchdown. So I wouldn't be surprised if we actually do see Green Bay able to just run the ball in the second half if Caleb's not able to move the ball down the field effectively. I'm going down to our next option with DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins is going to be higher than this in our rankings most weeks. Obviously, this past week, you only get the 9.6 fantasy points against the Denver Broncos. It was just a really tough matchup for Hopkins. I'm not really holding that against him. But this is just another really tough matchup that you have for him as well. Typically, we're used to seeing the Kansas City Chiefs project out score 25, 26, 27 points any given week. Well, here in a tough spot going up against Buffalo, their implied team total is actually down at 21.5. And for the first time this season, or at least the first time I can remember this season, the Kansas City Chiefs are actually dogs in this game. But I will say the positive with Hopkins is he has continued to expand his role in this offense. He's played 3 weeks in KC. You've gone from 32% to 60% to 65% of the team snaps. And I wouldn't be surprised if that gets bumped up to 70, 72%, 74% this week. Now, I continue to rank Amari Cooper every single week here, and he continues to miss every single week. Now, Amari's been at practice for weeks now. He's been teasing us for a while. We know we have no Keon Coleman. It's just impossible to rank these guys like Amari and Higgins, right? I mean, Higgins was also limited in practice this Wednesday. He wasn't really doing anything. It was just a walkthrough. My main concern that you have with Amari and Higgins is if they're not 100%, do you see both these teams just deciding to wait until after the bye week to bring him back because they both have a bye in week 12? So if they miss one more game, they could get an extra 2 weeks rest. Now going over to our next tier, we're going to be looking at Zay Flowers. With Flowers, I know y'all been upset with us ranking him this low all season, but I don't know. I still stand by. I think he's an up and down low end wide receiver too, that you can play in good matchups. You should probably avoid in bad ones. This is an offense that is going to be able to run the ball effectively when they're up in games. And this is also a very bad matchup that you have here going up against Pittsburgh. Clearly, Pittsburgh has had one of the best defenses in the NFL this season. Typically, we're used to seeing Baltimore project out to be the highest scoring offense in the NFL or the second or third, depending on where they stack up with Detroit and San Fran. But this week, you actually have an implied team total of only about 25.5 points. So it should be a lower scoring offense. And I think this is the first week that you actually begin to get some Deontay Johnson usage in this offense as well. Now, clearly, you can tell by these rankings, I think Zay Flowers is wide receiver 1, but I think Deontay could command more targets than Bateman has historically. Now, Devonta Smith will be our next option. I'm starting Smith in the Flock League. I really hope that Smith comes out here and absolutely crushes it on Thursday night so I can go through and I can do my little song and dance and clown on everybody. And do I have a big matchup? But to be realistic here, there are red flags. Like since he's returned from his injury, you've seen 4, 2, 7, 6, and 3 targets here. The man's averaging only about 5 targets a game. While at the same time, now you're getting Dallas Goedert back in, so maybe the target volume even stays depressed. He's been living off an unsustainable touchdown rate since the bye. So there are very real concerns with Devonta Smith for tonight's game. Is higher, lower on yards on Underdog Fantasy is 52.5. I really hope you get a blow up. I mean, you have a really nice projection here for this Eagles offense. They have an implied team total of 26 points. So it's a nice spot in general for the Eagles, but it could be on the ground. It's a good matchup. Ladd McConkey is in a great matchup. Here, Ladd, you're going up against Cincinnati. Obviously, the Cincinnati defense hasn't been super effective at stopping anyone so far this season. But the issue that you have with Ladd always is if you're in a spot in which you could see the Los Angeles Chargers easily winning the game, the passing volume is going to be extremely limited with Justin Herbert. You should expect rushing attempt after rushing attempt after rushing attempt. Here, going up against Cincinnati, it may not be the worst spot in the world, though, where the spread's only about 1.5. You have a 24-point implied team total here for the Chargers. And Ladd McConkey at the same time has consistently shown all season that he is the wide receiver 1 in this offense from a target volume perspective. And it should be a close game and good matchup. Darnell Mooney, I think a lot of weeks you can rank him higher than this. I mean, Mooney right now is the wide receiver 8 in total fantasy points. He's been phenomenal. He's just very much tied 1-for-1 with the passing volume in this offense. Like, the market share numbers are extremely consistent weekly. It just comes down to, okay, do you get a 300-yard passing day for Kirk Cousins? If that happens, Mooney's going to go off. If you have a lower volume day for Cousins, Mooney historically has struggled. It's simple math. I mean, it's very understandable. But you've had 3 straight games now with over 80 receiving yards for Darnell Mooney. I mean, you've had 3 straight games where he's had over 14 fantasy points. Obviously, he's had 4 games this season with under 10 fantasy points. But this matchup against Denver, I know, is not the best. I can already hear you in the comment section screaming at me, oh no, the matchup's actually going to be going over to Drake London. London's going to be the guy shut down and Mooney's going to be viable. And if you really wanted to go and take higher than 55.5 receiving yards on Mooney on Underdog, I'm not going to fault you for it, but I do think that there's inherently some risk seeing how this offense projects out much worse than usual. And an offense that actually projects out to be much better than usual is the Denver Broncos. Here in this game, the Broncos are actually favored by 2.5, 3 points. Right now, the Broncos have an implied team total about 23.25 points. Is this significantly higher than what you have seen over the past 2 weeks? And over the past 3 weeks here, Courtland Sutton has been a freaking beast. Sutton over the past 3 weeks has been averaging 10 targets a game. Sutton over the past 3 weeks is averaging almost 20 fantasy points per contest. He's averaging almost 100 receiving yards. Or maybe you want to say, well, this Sutton production over the past 3 weeks is touchdown fueled. It's going to be a little bit harder to predict. He only had 1 touchdown off of 30 targets. It's a good matchup. Sportsbooks are giving the Broncos a lot of credit here with their total points. So I think Sutton's a much easier start than he has been all season at this point. Calvin Ridley obviously has been dominating with volume as well. Since the bye week, Calvin Ridley is actually sitting here averaging about 10 targets per game. And over the past month, Calvin Ridley is averaging about 70, 80 receiving yards per contest. You have seen a lot of points allowed to the opposing wide receivers from this Minnesota Vikings defense so far this season. But again, consistently, you have the Tennessee Titans projected out to be one of the worst offenses in the NFL. I mean, this week, you have them, I believe, projected out to be tied dead last with an implied team total about 16.75 points. Now our next player will be Josh Downs. Obviously, we called him a buy low candidate earlier in the week based off the report that the coaching staff in Indianapolis said that they were not going to be going back to Anthony Richardson. Immediately, they changed their mind on that and they say, well, nope. Anthony Richardson's our guy. And with that in mind, the expectations dramatically come down here, of course. Now, last time you did have Anthony Richardson under center, you still did have an insane amount of volume going in the direction of Josh Downs. You had 9 targets, 109 receiving yards in a game where Richardson only had like 150 total passing yards. It was insane. Downs is very clearly the wide receiver 1, but it just should be such a bad passing offense. It's going to be much harder to trust him. Now, Brian Thomas is going to be in a similar situation as well, where we can say Thomas is probably a stud, but he's been banged up himself, as well as now you're stuck in just an absolute garbage offense with the Trevor Lawrence injury. I mean, a lot of people are speculating right now that we're not going to see Lawrence again this season. And if the season were to end today, the Jacksonville Jaguars would actually get the number 1 pick. Now, obviously, there are a bunch of teams that are currently sitting here with the 2-7 record. So it's not necessarily a spot where it's super easy to say that the Jags are in line for that first overall selection. But they are kind of to the point of the year where it is tank season. Going up against Detroit, they're like 2 touchdown dogs in this game. So it is a really, really tough spot to be excited about Thomas. Now, I'm ranking Cedric Tillman here at 29, fully aware that people are going to be threatening in the comment section to burn my house down. Cedric Tillman over the past 3 weeks has scored 3 touchdowns. Cedric Tillman over the past 3 weeks has averaged over 20 fantasy points per game. And at the same time, you actually do have a decent projection here for this Cleveland Browns offense, where you have sportsbooks putting the Browns with an implied team total of 21.5 points. That's higher than Jacksonville. That's higher than Indy. That's higher than Tennessee. Hell, that's higher than Atlanta this week. If you go over and if you look at what you have with Tillman with the underdog projections, he's currently higher, lower, 56.5 receiving yards. So right in line with the other receivers that we have him ranked in this same tier with. And of course, if you want to go Mason, that's clownish. He's going to crush that. He's had over 75 receiving yards every week over the past 3. You definitely can say that. My thought process is it is a little bit of a limited sample. And if you look at the amount of pass attempts going to Judy and Elijah Moore, it's not like Cedric Tillman sitting here with a 30% team target share. So I'm very willing to continue to move Cedric Tillman up a tier every single week that he produces. But obviously, my style is I'm going to be a little bit slower to react, and I'm going to wait until we get a little bit of a larger sample rather than trying to overreact to a 3-game span. Now, Jackson Smith-Njigba will be our next option. With JSN over the past 3 weeks, he's also averaging about 20 points per game. Obviously, all this coming from this past week where he played the Los Angeles Rams and you had the 180 receiving yards. You had the 2 receiving touchdowns. But since then, you had the bye week in week 10 for Seattle. This is allowing DK Metcalf to come in. As of Wednesday, DK Metcalf's already practicing in full. DK Metcalf should be 100% for this week. And it is a pretty tough matchup going up against San Fran as well. I mean, last time JSN played the Niners, scored 10.3 fantasy points. Obviously, that's not everything. DJ Moore does not look startable at this point. I mean, if you're looking at DJ Moore, I think as the week goes on, I may even move him lower in these rankings. But the man has not had a game with double-digit fantasy points since back in week 5 against Carolina. I will say we freaking nailed that sell high call. And you have an implied team total of about 17.5 points here. So the Bears do project out to be a bottom 5 offense in the NFL this week. The saving grace that you could potentially have here in Chicago is the change with the offensive coordinator, where obviously everybody hated the OC when he was in Seattle. Everybody hated him the second he goes over to Chicago. And maybe the change with the coaching staff does elevate the play of Caleb. But right now, sportsbooks aren't pricing that in. Now, our next option is going to be Shakir. Shakir very easily could move up these ranks. I don't love the matchup going up against the Chiefs. You do have an implied team total much lower here for the Bills than what we're used to. Now, I will say with that, you have no Keon. Not only do you have no Keon, but at the same time, you are sitting here with potentially no Dalton Kincaid, and Amari is still banged up. So if you were to have no Amari and you were to have no Kincaid, then at that point, Shakir probably flies up to be the same tier with the range of the Pickens options. Now, Jacoby Myers is a super safe option when it comes to the target volume should expect. Over the past 5 games that Myers has played, I mean, you're sitting here with about 8-9 targets per contest. Now, maybe the only hesitation and the only drawback that you have with Myers, of course, is the fact that you do project to be in one of the worst offenses in the league where touchdowns will be hard to come by. And at the same time, we can assume that Bowers does have a high touchdown share. Jalen Waddle will be our next option. With Waddle, he has not had a game with double-digit fantasy points since week 1. But you do currently have sportsbooks projecting out this to be a massive bounce-back spot for the Miami Dolphins. So if you expect that the Dolphins go out there and they are a top 5 offense this week, as sportsbooks are projecting, then you do have some potential spike week appeal here with Waddle, especially if you believe that Tyreek's wrist injury is going to continue to linger through the rest of the season. But again, if we're looking at the data, it is screaming that you should expect a Dolphins bounce back offensively. The Dolphins are freaking 8-point favorites in this game. Juwan Jennings will be our next option. I stand by. I think Jennings is the guy over Ricky Pearsall here. Jennings had 11 targets against Tampa. Now, with that being said, it was a phenomenal matchup going up against the Bucs, right? I mean, here, this is going to be a different situation playing Seattle. I think you could see McCaffrey run the ball just a little bit more. And I don't know if we get 350 plus passing yards for Brock Purdy every single week. While at the same time, I do think that Debo is going to take more work in this offense. Tank Dell looks very difficult to start considering the fact that Nico Collins is coming back in. Like, yes, yeah, the 2 weeks against Indy and the Jets when Diggs gets injured in the Indy game. You have no Diggs, no Nico in the Jets game where Dell cracks 10 fantasy points, but Tanktail's yet to have a total of 20 fantasy points this season. You're playing Dallas, where you presumably can just run the ball because Dallas shouldn't be able to throw. Jameson will be our next option here. If you are looking at Jameson, boom bust appeal, where obviously the only thing you're banking in on is a long receiving touchdown. I'll say we definitely nailed the sell high candidate early in the season as well. But yeah, I mean, since after the first 2 weeks, you've seen 3, 2, 4, 1, and 5 targets. The issue is, again, we've explained this 1,000 times. Jameson's a great real life receiver because he's going to stretch NFL defenses, create space underneath for the other options. But for fantasy football purposes, he's not going to see the consistent target volume to be viable. Now, Romeo Doubs will be our next option. If you are looking at Doubs, this is a receiver that's had more volume than Reed over the past month or so. But here this week, it's not a good matchup going up against Chicago, as we've already discussed. This game does have an over-under of only about 41 points. And really, I think it's just difficult to start anybody in Green Bay not named Josh Jacobs or Jaden Reed because the targets are going to be dispersed through so many different options. And then our last tier full of guys that you can start if you're absolutely desperate. Jordan Addison, I drafted in a bunch of underdog teams. Everybody called me an idiot at the time. Proves that they were right. I was wrong. Dear God, Addison's had one game with 20 or more fantasy points. I have a lot of Ricky Pearsall in underdog drafts. That's not looking too bad at this point. But the issue with Pearsall is he only plays 64% of the snaps this past week. And again, we're expecting the passing volume to come down here in San Fran. I'm looking at Keenan Allen. You have one game this season with double-digit fantasy points. Your only hope is the offensive coordinator can elevate the offense. Rome Odunze, same thing as Keenan. Xavier Worthy's just been an absolute freaking bomb. Can't believe we labeled this. Well, first, we nailed him as the sell high after week 1. That was very clear. But can't believe we freaking said to buy low on him after. Deontay Johnson, I think he expands his role in this offense this week. Again, if you could pick him up off the waiver wire or get him as a throw-in and a deal, I'm fine taking Deontay. It was unfair to assume that he was going to do anything the first 2 weeks in Baltimore. And then Christian Watson, again, similar to somebody like Romeo Doubs. I don't know. They're just a bunch of wide receivers in Green Bay. It's a great offense, but it's dispersed in so many different directions. It is very difficult to expect that you get much from any of these guys. But I really do appreciate you and really hope I was able to help you out with this. Of course, if y'all want to say, Mason, you're an idiot, Cedric Tillman, of course, is going to have more than 56.5 receiving yards. You can find that over there on Underdog Fantasy. Promo code FLOCK, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you're going to be getting a free Jalen Hurts pick for tonight, more than less than half total yard, and a free team review over there on flockfantasy.com. Just make sure that you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your account on Underdog Fantasy. That way we can go ahead and credit you with that free team review voucher the following day. But thank you again. I really do appreciate you. Really hope I was able to help you out in some way. And really hope I get to see you in the live stream later tonight.